Good morning. Welcome to Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Fress, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com. Thanks for tuning in this morning. And as I hope my listeners are anxious to continue our reading and discussion of the book, The Papacy and the Civil Power by R.W. Thompson, continuing our discussion about the Pseudo-Isidorian decretals, the false decretals that form the basis for Roman Catholic canon law, a blasphemous law, and a law that literally makes the papacy the king of kings on the earth, God's representative on the earth, and that he has the power to seat and to unseat kings and rule over the people by divine right. And it also grants him unlimited immunity, that the papacy, the Pope has the right to judge every man, but no man has the right to judge him. Yesterday we began our discussion in chapter 13, the beginning of chapter 13 in the book, page 387 if you're following along. And we'll back up a paragraph or two for continuity, and we'll begin. R.W. Thompson says, we shall leave our investigations incomplete and our task unfinished without further notice of the false decretals and their contribution to the growth of the temporal power, inasmuch as the principles derived from them still remain a part of the canon law of Rome. Those of the encyclical and syllabus of Pope Pius IX being taken in part from them, and as the present struggles of the papacy and its Jesuit supporters are designed for the purpose of reviving and enforcing them wheresoever they can obtain the power to do so. So R.W. Thompson has given us a brief series of reasons why we should continue further investigating the effects of these false decretals upon the world. Now, although there were many good and pious Christians among the early popes and clergy of Rome, yet there was enough in the vicious habits of many of them who constituted the priesthood at the time when these decretals are alleged to have been dated to justify the assignment of them to the popes whose names they bear. Many of them yielded to the influence of the example of Pope Victor, and the effect was apparent in their ambition and that of the clergy, which existed to such a degree that religion was almost entirely neglected, except in the mere ceremonial requirements of the church. We have the authority of Eusebius, who is quoted by all Roman Catholic ecclesiastical authors as reliable authority for the condition of the priesthood in this time. There is no other author whose history covers the times in which he refers, and as a leading prelate and a member of the celebrated Council of Nice, he had ample opportunity for ascertaining the true condition of affairs. Here's what he says. Listen to the condition of the Roman Catholic Church during the time when these decretals were discovered and the popes began to rule under those pretexts. It says, but some that appeared to be our pastors, deserting the law of piety, were inflamed against each other with mutual strifes, only accumulating quarrels and threats, rivalship, hostility, and hatred to each other, only anxious to assert the government as a kind of sovereignty for themselves, unquote. You see what happens when you mix politics and religion? Politics takes the precedent, and there was just a worldly endeavor of the Roman Catholic Church. Lost were any pretext of a religious institution except for just the formal ceremonial aspects. The church was all about extending its power, and there was a lot of infighting, turf wars among the priests and prelates of the Roman Catholic Church. Now, As it is said by Cormenin that Marcellinus, who was pope from the year 304 and has been canonized a saint, even abjured the Christian religion in order to thereby to escape the persecution of the Emperor Diocletian. So here we have a pope in the year 304 AD that was in other words, he renounced Christianity to save himself from persecution from the emperor. So it's not a very dedicated church, is it? And it says, even if these things were not true to the extent alleged, they were sufficiently so beyond all question to have had an injurious influence upon the cause of true piety and to have placed the affairs of the church in an unsettled and precarious condition, the precise extent of which is now exceedingly difficult to ascertain. Now, Eusebius further, in a note here in the book, elaborates upon the condition of the priests and the prelates of the church at this time. In his Ecclesiastical History, Book 8, Chapter 1, he says, at another place, in his Book of Martyrs, when speaking of the prelates of the church, Eusebius says that he had, quote, thought proper to pass by, unquote, other events than those related to him, that is, quote, particularly the circumstances of the different heads of the churches who, from being shepherds of the reasonable flocks of Christ, did not govern in a lawful and becoming manner, were condemned by divine justice as unworthy of such a charge. In other words, the priests were not at all worthy of leading the flocks of Christ. And it says, moreover, the ambitious aspirings of many to office and the injudicious and unlawful ordinations that took place, the divisions among the confessors themselves, the great schisms and difficulties industriously fomented by the factions among the new members against the relics of the church, devised one innovation after another, and unmercifully thrusted them into the midst of all these calamities, heaping up affliction upon affliction. All this, I say, I have resolved to pass by, judging it foreign to my purpose, wishing, as I said in the beginning, to shun and avoid giving an account of them, unquote. In other words, Eusebius didn't want to even talk about them. It's so shameful. Okay? The conditions that arose in the Roman Catholic Church were disastrous after the promulgation of this canon law based on the pseudo-Isidorian decretals and the turf wars that resulted from it. The earthliness, the worldliness of the Roman Catholic Church became glaringly apparent. Okay? And it ought to be apparent to us today that she's still in the same business. She just uses religion or Christ to deceive the nations and the people. Anyway, we'll continue where we left off, and it says, and this accounts in a large measure for the pertinacity with which these false decretals have been assigned to those times. Their authors well understood at the date of their origin, and their defenders understand now how easy it is to make history and to make it acceptable to the credulous minds, especially where there's no precise detail of facts to expose their falsehoods and assumptions. By all Roman Catholics who accept the teachings of the Church uninquiringly, these decretals are regarded yet as true and genuine because they have been put forth and endorsed by infallible popes and because they are so instructed by their bishops and the priests, while the bishops and the priests deliberately employ them as a means of continuing their hierarchical power and authority and thus gratifying their inordinate ambition. So the only reason that these false decretals survive today is because they lend power and security to the priests. It's the source of all of their ambition. Now, Mosheim, after pointing out how difficult the ecclesiastical system of the 9th century was from that which prevailed in the ancient church, says that the popes found it, quote, necessary to produce the authority of ancient deeds to stop the mouths of such as were disposed to set bounds to their usurpations, unquote. And then he proceeds further. He said, quote, the bishops of Rome were aware of this, and as those means were deemed the most lawful that tended best to accomplish their purposes, they employed some of the most ingenious and zealous partisans in forging, that is, falsifying conventions, acts of councils, epistles, and the like records, by which it might appear that in the first ages of the church the Roman pontiffs were clothed with the same spiritual majesty and supreme authority which they now assumed. Among these fictitious supports of the papal dignity, the famous decretal epistles, which we've been talking about, as they are called, said to have been written by the pontiffs of the primitive time, deserve chiefly to be stigmatized. They were the production of an obscure writer who fraudulently prefixed them the name of Isidore, Bishop of Seville, to make the world believe that they had been collected by this illustrious and learned prelate. Some of them had appeared in the 8th century, but were now entirely drawn from their obscurity and produced with an air of ostentation and triumph to demonstrate the supremacy of the Roman pontiffs. The decisions of a certain Roman council, which is said to have been holden during the pontificate of Sylvester, were likewise alleged in behalf of this same cause, but this council had not been heard of before the present century, and the accounts now given of it proceeded from the same source with the decretals, and equally authentic, or in other words, an abject fraud. Be that as it may, the decrees of this pretended council contributed much to enrich and to aggrandize the Roman pontiffs, and exalt them above all human authority and jurisdiction, unquote. Dean Millman, one of the most learned and reliable authors of the present time, says, quote, the false decretals do not merely assert the supremacy of the popes, the dignity and the privileges of the Bishop of Rome. They comprehend the whole dogmatic system and discipline of the Church, the whole hierarchy from the highest to the lowest degree, their sanctity and immunities, their persecutions, their disputes, their right of appeal to Rome, but for the two manifest design, the aggrandizement of the See of Rome and the aggrandizement of the whole clergy in subordination to the See of Rome, but for the monstrous ignorance of history, which betrays itself in glaring anachronisms and in the utter confusion of the order of events and the lives of distinguished men, the former awakening keen and zealous suspicion, the latter making the detection of the superiorness of the whole easy, clear, and irrefragable. The false decretals might still have maintained their place in ecclesiastical history. They are now given up by all. Not a voice is raised in their favor. The utmost that is done by those who cannot suppress all regret at their explosion is to palliate the guilt of the forger, to call in question or to weaken the influence which they had in their own day and throughout the latter history of Christianity, unquote. That they are now and have been for many years regarded as forgeries by candid Roman Catholics, even among the ultramontanes, is undoubtedly true. Marchetti says, quote, learned men of great piety have declared against these false collections, which Cardinal Bona frankly calls a quote-unquote pious fraud. Baronius does not as frankly regard them as a fraud. Nevertheless, he would not use them in his ecclesiastical annals, lest it should be believed that the Roman Catholic Church needed suspicious documents to establish her rights, unquote. Marchetti also says, quote, "We may conjecture that Isidore gathered the decretals of ancient popes, which the persecutions of the first centuries had not permitted to be collected, and that, animated by a desire to transmit the collection to posterity, he made such haste that he overlooked some faults and chronological errors, which were afterward corrected by a more exact criticism," unquote. While they are here rejected as false, or at least as suspicious, there's an evident disinclination to give them up. Yet Fleury, the great Roman Catholic historian, is too frank to participate in the imposture or to exhibit any such inconsistency. He thus disposes of them. Listen to what he says. "The subject matter of these letters reveals their spuriousness. They speak of archbishops, primates, patriarchs, as if these titles had existed from the birth of the Church. They forbid the holding of any council, even a provisional one, without permission from the Pope, and represent appeals to Rome as habitual. Frequent complaint is therein made of usurpations of the temporalities of the Church. We find there this maxim, quote, that bishops falling into sin may, after having done penance, exercise their functions as before," unquote. Finally, the principal subject of these decretals is that of complaints against bishops. There's scarcely one that does not speak of them and gives rules of making them difficult. And Isidore makes it very apparent in his preface that he had this matter deeply at heart, unquote. So here's another historian that, reviewing these decretals, simply comes to the conclusion they're fabrications and they are only designed to give the Pope supreme power in the world and immunity from any crime he may commit. Now, the purpose and immediate effect of the false decretals were shown in the last chapter in the encyclicals, decrees, and letters of Pope Nicholas I. It was during his pontificate that they took, quote, their place in the jurisprudence of Latin Christendom, unquote. In other words, the Roman Catholic Church, by becoming an essential part of, quote, the law of the Church, unquote. He introduced them at Rome with true pontifical audacity, and the whole history of his pontificate shows he regarded them as contributing material aid to his ambition. He did not hesitate to employ them, most unblushingly, as a justification for his outrageous blasphemies and usurpations. Now, when it is remembered that he did not become pope until the year 858, that previous to that time nothing of the kind had been known to exist at Rome, and that the assumption of all-absorbing supremacy was based upon these palpable forgeries, he must be a bold man and greatly insensible to shame, who will in this enlightened and inquiring age attempt to excuse or palliate his conduct. Even during his pontifical reign, powerful as he became, the French or Gallican Christians and their bishops were not subdued by his threats of anathema and excommunication. Now, here's a case, as we discussed before, that the French Catholics, the Gallicans as they were called, rebelled against the papacy, especially during this time of the rise and practice of the pseudo-Isidorian decretals and the infallibility of the popes and his right to meddle in the affairs of nations. The Gallican Christians put their foot down, and we're going to talk about that as we continue. It says, even during his pontifical reign, powerful as he became, the French, or Gallican, Bishops were not, someday I'll learn to read. Even during his pontifical reign, powerful as he became, the French or Gallican bishops were not subdued by his threats of anathema and excommunication. After the Synod of Metz in France had sustained the claims of Lothair to his kingdom, which Nicholas was endeavoring to wrestle from him, he tore up its decrees, pronounced it to be, quote, an assembly of brigands and robbers, unquote, and, quote, declared the French prelates to be deprived of episcopal power, unquote. He excommunicated and anathematized all who opposed his measures of his grasping ambition. But Gonthier, Metropolitan of Cologne, Tutgard, Archbishop of Treves, John of Ravenna, and a great number of other bishops addressed him in a letter wherein they called him infamous, a greedy robber, the murderer of Christians, iniquitous and cruel priest, sanguinary wolf, cowardly tyrant, the most infamous of the ministers of the temple of God, shameless cockatrice, venomous serpent, dog, and by other names equally expressive of indignation and contempt, and concluded with these words. Listen to this. Quote, we doubt neither thy venom nor thy bite. We have resolved with our brethren to tear thy sacrilegious decretals, thy impious bulls, and will leave thee to growl forth thy powerless thunders. Thou darest to accuse of impiety those who refuse from love to the faith to submit to thy sacrilegious laws. Thou who castest discord among Christians, thou who violatest evangelical peace, that immortal mark which Christ has placed upon the forehead of his church. Thou, execrable pontiff, who spits upon the book of thy God, thou darest to call us impious. How then wilt thou call the clergy, which bends before thy power, thus unworthy priest, vomited forth from hell, and whose forehead is of wax, their heart of steel, and their sides are formed of the wine of Sodom and Gomorrah? Go to, these ministers are well made to crawl under thy abominable pride in thy Rome, frightful Babylon, which thou callest the holy city, eternal and infallible. Go to thy cohort of priests, soiled with adulteries, incest, rapes, and assassinations, as well worthy to form thy infamous court. For Rome is the residence of demons, and thou, Pope, thou art its Satan. Unquote. Pretty harsh words for the Pope of Rome, who declares to be the vicar of Christ. But these Gallican Christians stood up. These Gallican Roman Catholics, French Roman Catholics, stood up and told the truth about their Pope. Isn't that what we should do today? We'll be right back after this.
Years ahead of the dominant media, FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on Internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the Internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Have you seen the Left Behind movies? Have you read the Left Behind fictional book series? Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. Because they see the world stage shaping to fulfill what they have been led to believe is sound biblical interpretation, a left behind rapture scenario, this false view of prophecy is reinforced in the mind, not only of its adherents, but also includes those who have been merely exposed to the specific media. Is it possible that false prophecy can be fulfilled? The rapture theories have always been in dispute. Pre-trib, mid-trib, and post-trib disputes have risen up in exclusively evangelical circles of recent history, so that when true believers don't suddenly disappear, this element will easily go by the wayside when all see a new Jewish temple begin to be built. Will this be part of the great delusion that will come upon the whole earth? It seems that this great prophetic delusion has already overcome practically the entire American evangelical and Christian world. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. To learn more, visit crosstheborder.org. That's CROSS, crosstheborder.org.
Okay, welcome back to the second half hour of Inquisition Update. We're reading this extraordinary account of the papacy under the auspices of these false decretals, these pseudo-Isidorian decretals, attempts to put his boot heel upon the necks of the Roman Catholics in France. And the Roman Catholics stood up. They stood up. The French Catholics, the Gallicans of France, stood up and told the Pope what he could do with his false decretals and the power that he derived from them, and stay the hell out of France's domestic problems. Stay out of France's domestic business. Isn't it amazing that these French Roman Catholics dared to tell their Pope to shuffle off to Buffalo? And that's what happened all throughout history. Catholics would finally get sick and tired of the papacy messing around in their political... Look, they were sovereign independent nations, or so they believed. They loved the freedom. But the papacy always asserts that it is the vicar of Christ on earth, that he is a spiritual king, and therefore, in order to make the people good Christians, he must rule in their domestic affairs, under the pretense that it is his divine right to rule the world, the King of Kings and Lord of Lords. And repeatedly throughout history, Catholics have risen up against this pretended authority of the papacy, declared it an abject fraud, and kicked the Pope out of their country and his Jesuit priests. Now, what would happen if the whole world at the same time did the same thing? That's what needs to happen. But it doesn't appear that there's the will to do it. You know, much rather than being under the boot heel of a ruthless tyrant in Rome, I would rather be under the benevolent rule of Christ. Christ himself, my Savior, the one who died for me, who loved me enough to die for me. Is he not the King of Kings and Lord of Lords? Indeed he is. Then who is this impostor in Rome? He's a mere man, fallible and sinful beyond any measure. And it's time for the whole world to come to that unanimous conclusion. Now, we'll continue the book. It says, these bold and defiant words go to prove that there was, for a time at least, formidable opposition to the ambitious intrigues of the popes. The French and German clergy were so far removed from the neighborhood of Rome that they were slow to become the mere slaves of papal dictation. They looked rather to their own sovereigns for protection, which soon brought them all, sovereigns and subjects, under the Pope's censure and excommunication. And thus arose out of these decretals the abhorrent and dangerous doctrine which so disgraced the Middle Ages, by which the popes claimed the power to release the subjects of their allegiance to any disobedient prince, and to put any of these kingdoms under interdict on account of matters merely temporal, and in no way concerning the faith of the Church. An instance of this kind occurred under the pontificate of Adrian II, the immediate successor of Nicholas I. When Lothair, king of Lorraine, died, he left no rightful heir to his kingdom, and a claim to it was set up by his brother Louis, who prevailed upon Pope Adrian to espouse his cause and to interfere in his behalf by the employment of his pontifical authority. The Pope wrote to the lords of Lorraine, not requesting merely, but commanding them to support the pretensions of Louis. He irreverently and impiously made this command, quote, in the name of Christ, unquote, and threatened all the metropolitans, dukes, and counts with excommunication in the extent of their disobedience. He told them that if they did not obey him, they should, quote, be struck by the arms which God has placed in our, meaning his, hands, for the defense of his princes, unquote, thus perverting the religious functions of his office by using them to accomplish ends entirely worldly. Charles the Bald, in the meantime, seized upon the dominions of Lothair and was crowned king of Lorraine with the consent of the people and by the bishops of the kingdom. Pope Adrian was greatly incensed, as you might well imagine. He declared that all who should assist Charles in his diabolical usurpation, quote, would fall under anathema and be given up to the companions of the devil, unquote. He told the bishops of Lorraine that by the coronation of Charles, quote, they were preparing him for hell, unquote. While he did not accomplish anything by this impertinent intermeddling with the affairs of a government over which he had no legal control, yet he exhibited the purpose to interpose his pontifical power between Charles and his subjects, and thus to make himself master of their temporal affairs. That he did it under the claim of authority assumed by previous popes and affirmed by the false decretals, there's no reason to doubt. Milman says, quote, he quoted against the king the irrefragable authority of passages from the pseudo-Isidorian decretals, unquote. That is, from the pretended letters of Popes Lucius and Stephen. And thus these miserable forgeries began early to bear their natural fruit. So strongly did Adrian rely upon them, these false decretals, to sustain his presumptuous demands, that he ventured to censure Charles for having dared to insult his pontifical authority and for not having prostrated himself at the feet of his legates. His letter to him concludes thus, quote, "Impious king, we order thee to retire from the kingdom of Lorraine and to surrender it to the Emperor Louis. If thou refusest submission to our will, we will ourselves go into France to excommunicate thee and to drive thee from thy wicked throne." Unquote. King of Kings, right? Now, finding Charles unmoved by his threats, Adrian sent legates to France to excite Carloman, the king's son, to revolt against his father, a favorite mode of procedure with popes of that age, and which they tried to justify to themselves and to the world upon the ground that the good of the church required it, and therefore that God approved it. Carloman willingly entered into the papal plans, but he was arrested by Charles the Bald before they were carried into execution and severely punished. Charles then sent the Pope's legates back to Rome and accompanied by his own ambassadors who bore a letter from Hinchmar, Archbishop of Reims, on his own behalf and that of the French bishops, in which Adrian was severely censured and given to understand in plain and most emphatic terms that neither his anathemas nor his excommunications would prevent Charles from holding on to the kingdom of Lorraine. At this, the Pope became perfectly infuriated and immediately wrote to Charles, calling him an execrable prince, ordered him to the surrender of Lorraine to Carloman, whose treason he had already excited, and informed him that if he did not, he would send his legates into the accursed kingdom to deal with him as he should think proper. He commanded the French lords not to take up arms in defense of their king, the French bishops not to obey his orders, all under the penalty of excommunication and eternal damnation. Turned the army against him. Turned the bishops against him. See how the popes abused their temporal power, of which they have none by authority of Christ? It says Charles now became irated, quote, by the audacity and insolence of this letter, unquote, and instructed Archbishop Hinchmar to give the Pope to understand in unmistakable terms and without further equivocation that he would no longer submit to his unwarrantable interference with the domestic affairs of France. Among other things, Hinchmar's letter in behalf of the king contained these strong words, quote, "We are established by God sovereign over the people, and are armed with a twofold sword to strike the wicked and defend the good," unquote. Bold as the Pope was, and secure as he felt himself to be in that ignorant and superstitious age under the protection of the false decretals, he now became alarmed at the intrepidity of the King of France. He knew that Hinchmar had counseled the king to separate France from Italy, on account mainly of the controversy between the Pope and the Gallican Christians, and he greatly dreaded this result on account of the fact that the withdrawal of the French protection would expose Rome to powerful and vindictive enemies in other directions. He was anxious to hold on to France by means of the alliance formed by his predecessors with Pepin and Charlemagne, and govern its kings, at least to the extent of being able to employ their military strength in defense of the papacy. But finding Charles not disposed to bow before him, either his courage failed him, or he resolved upon practicing such duplicity as other popes besides him have well understood how to employ. In this art he was a perfect adept. Consequently, he immediately retracted everything he had said against Charles in a letter which, as a specimen of papal insincerity and hypocrisy, has scarcely a parallel. It shows how unreliable has been the judgment of at least one of the great popes about the duty which men owe to God. What it is one day is not the next, according as the Pope's view of temporal policy may change, or as the papacy is the gainer or the loser. Here's what he said to the king. Quote, Prince Charles, we have apprised thy virtuous persons that you are the most zealous protector of the churches in the world, that there exists not in your eminent kingdom any bishopric or monastery on which you have not heaped wealth. And we know that you honor the see of St. Peter, and that you desire to spread your liberality on his vicar, and to defend him against all his enemies. We consequently retract our former decisions, recognizing that you have acted with justice in punishing a guilty son of a prelatical debauchee, and in causing yourself to be declared sovereign of Lorraine and Burgundy. We renew to you the assurance that we, the clergy, the people, and the nobility of Rome, wait with impatience for the day on which you shall be declared king, patrician, emperor, and defender of the church. We, however, beseech you to keep this letter secret from your nephew, Louis. Oh, hypocrisy knows no bounds in the papacy. And it says, thus we see how these false decretals became a part of the canon law of Rome, how they were expressly prepared in aid of papal ambition, and how unblushingly they were employed to justify perfidious popes in assuming, as one of their official prerogatives derived from Peter the Apostle, the right to dictate the temporal policy of governments, to make and unmake kings, to require universal obedience, such obedience as should be prescribed by an ecclesiastical hierarchy raised above all human laws, entitled to commit the highest crimes and to perpetrate all sorts of wrongs with impunity and without responsibility to any tribunals except those which were the mere passive and submissive tools of the papal will. True, the blow aimed by Adrian II at the rights of the French king recoiled upon his own head, and taught him that the Gallican Christians under the head of Hinchmar were not as easily reduced to obedience as were those of Italy, upon whose necks he had already planted his pontifical heel. But his immediate successor, John VIII, endeavored to recover from the effects of this recoil and to regain the ground he had lost by recognizing the refractory Charles as the legitimate sovereign of Lorraine and Burgundy. This he resolved to do, if possible, by imitating the perfidious policies of Adrian, so as to bring Charles, by flattery, into the meshes of his pontifical net, a result which he well understood could not be accomplished by threats. Subtlety and flattery. The papacy has a serpent's tongue, doesn't he? And it says, accordingly he offered him, quote, the protector of the Holy See. Offered him the title of protector of the Holy See. How gratuitous is that? Accordingly, he offered to make him the protector of the Holy See, and for that purpose invited him to Rome. Charles could not resist the temptation. Here's the weakness of sinful men who love to be flattered, drawn into the Pope's trap by flattery. Charles could not resist the temptation, and upon going to Rome was crowned emperor by the Pope, who, true to the papal policy, took care to say to him, as he placed the crown upon his head, quote, do not forget, Prince, that the popes have the right to create emperors, unquote. Charles was overcome by his ambition, and by accepting the crown upon these conditions, reduced the empire over which he presided to the humiliating condition of a fief to the Holy See, and gave his sanction to the custom of crowning emperors by the popes, and in the end, to the recognition of their authority over all the governments and temporal affairs of Europe. With what complacency such examples as this are referred to by the papal writers in proof of the Pope's supremacy. An agreement between kings and popes that they shall jointly govern all mankind is held up to the world as a part of the law of God. Shall this example of the 9th century be repeated in the 19th? And I'll ask my listeners, shall it be repeated in the 21st? Or shall those who are now seeking to repeat it be rebuked by the voice of popular indignation, which shall ring in the ears so long as they shall live? But the end sought for was only reached by slow degrees and by gradual usurpations. It took many years of severe struggle on the part of the popes to consummate it, by the abolition of the old and the introduction of the new ecclesiastical system founded upon the pseudo-Isidorian decretals. It required the combined intellect, courage, and unbending will of the three great popes, Gregory VII, Alexander III, and Innocent III, to do what all the other popes were unable to accomplish. That is, to elevate the papacy above all nations and place emperors and kings at their feet. The author of the book entitled The Pope and the Council, a book that deserves careful study, and by the way, I'm looking for a copy of that book, so if you got a line on one, send me an email at tom@seawaves.us. It says, the author of The Pope and the Council, a book that deserves careful study, not merely because of the great ability it displays, but because it is written by a Roman Catholic, though opposed to papal infallibility, thus speaks of the times following immediately after the pontificates of Nicholas I, Adrian II, and John VIII. Quote, nearly 3 centuries passed before the seed sown produced its full harvest. For almost 200 years, from the death of Nicholas I to the time of Leo IX, the Holy See was in a condition which did not allow of any systematic acquisition and enforcement of new or extended rights. For about 60 years, from 883 to 955, the Roman Church was enslaved and degraded, while the Apostolic See became the prey and the plaything of rival factions of the nobles, and for a long time of ambitious and profligate women. It was only renovated by a brief interval from 997 to 1003 in the persons of Gregory V and Sylvester II by the influence of the Saxon emperor. Then the papacy sunk back into utter confusion and moral impotence. The Tuscan counts made it heredity in their family. Again and again, dissolute boys like John XII and Benedict IX occupied and disgraced the apostolic throne, which was now bought and sold like a piece of merchandise, and at last 3 popes fought for the tiara, until the Emperor Henry III put an end to the scandal by elevating a German bishop to the See of Rome. That's right, the corruption got so bad that at one time the papacy was occupied by 3 popes at once. And the author gives us some notes about John XII and Benedict IX. We'll read them. John XII was made pope in 956 when he did not exceed 18 years of age, and some authors represent him as only 12 years old. He was exceedingly dissolute and was accused of incest with his own mother. Baronius, the great annalist, called him an abortion. See Cormenin, Volume 1, page 292. Now, on Benedict IX, who became Pope in 1033 at 12 years of age, he was driven from Rome, and Sylvester III was made Pope in 1044. Sylvester was driven out by Benedict at the end of about 3 months, when the latter again mounted the pontifical throne. He then sold the tiara for 15,000 pounds of gold to John the 20th, who entered upon the pontificate in 1045. Benedict soon dissipated the money when he retook the chair of Peter from John, thus making 3 quote-unquote vicars at the same time. They finally agreed to hold their orgies together and, quote, filled Rome with adultery, robbery, and murder, unquote, and finally united in selling the pontificate to Gregory VI and concluded the bargain, quote, on the very altar of Christ itself, unquote. Clement II succeeded Gregory VI when Benedict IX, at the head of the troop of brigands, again seized the throne. The emperor then made Damasus II Pope, and Benedict, getting rid of him by poison in a few days, once more placed the tiara upon his brow. The Emperor of Germany then put an end to these disgraceful scenes by giving the pontificate to Leo IX. This is the papacy, the history of the papacy. The papacy bought and sold like a cow. Simony, that's what the Bible calls simony. The exchange of ecclesiastical favor for money. Characterized by Simon Magus, Simon the magician, Simon the sorcerer. And he still sets the precedent for his legacy. Not the Apostle Peter. Simon the sorcerer's legacy. The papacy of the Roman Catholic Church. Sorry to quit here, but we've run out of time, and we'll pick up where we left off tomorrow on the broadcast. Thanks for listening. You've been listening to Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. What a pleasure it is to reveal truths so rare today. I'll see you tomorrow.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.
I know you all want answers, and believe me, so do I, and I'll do my best to get them.
Despite Nicolas Cage's promise to do his best to get left behind rapture answers for us, don't hold your breath. Not everyone believes Left Behind is true prophecy. Some may even regard as conspiratorial the mainstream re-release of the Left Behind movie, with actor Nicolas Cage portraying the main character, as an attempt to further reinforce in the minds of all this perception of false prophecy, in order to condition the masses for the play about to begin. If you want true Bible prophecy answers, get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. The author exposes the Latin rapture origin, the 7-year tribulation deception, true Bible revelation of Daniel's 70 weeks, the abomination of desolation, the restrainer, America in the Revelation, the image of the beast and the mark of the beast, and the truth about God's chosen people, and so much more about Bible prophecy. This book will shatter the Left Behind paradigm of future events. Get the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of the book, The Rapture Will Be Canceled. That's crosstheborder.org.